Okay. We are filming now, so tell us a bit about yourself first, Karen, and your involvement with Safewards.
I'm Karen. I have been working within the team for the last 4 years, and I helped deliver the Safewards pilot study that we did before the trial, and also helped coordinate the main Safewards trial.
Okay. So you know lots about how nurses in the real world get on with implementing, or maybe not implementing, the Safewards interventions when they're asked. Can you tell us all about that?
Yeah, so nurses' responses to the interventions is something that's really important, and it's really crucial. It's what determines whether an intervention is implemented or not. So this was something we were really aware of, and something we wanted to try and record during the trial. So we had 11 researchers going out on the wards working really hard with the nurses to get the interventions up and running. And we asked them to just record the most notable responses that they observed during each visit. So we got over 1,000 reports from them, and we've been looking at them to try and come up with a typology or to come up with a way of summarising the different types of responses that you can get. What we found was that there were really 4 main types of response. The first is adoption, so this is when people take up the interventions. That's great. The second is ambivalence. So this is when people aren't really quite sure how they feel about the interventions, normally take quite a passive role in implementation. The third is resistance, which is when staff really don't want to implement the interventions, and that's the real challenging one. And then the final is abandonment. So this was when staff started implementing the interventions and then stopped midway through the trial. I think of those 4, obviously the most important one is resistance. And what we found was that resistance can take many different forms. So probably the least extreme form of resistance is passive resistance. So this was when staff didn't really want to implement the interventions, but they actually wouldn't tell you that they didn't want to. So what would happen was that our researchers would be out on the wards and ask them to do something, and they'd say, yeah, sure. And then they just wouldn't do it. So that was quite a difficult one to deal with, because there wasn't any scope for having a conversation with staff about that. The second was something that we called mild subversion, and this was when staff kind of indicated to our researchers that they weren't really taking the interventions very seriously, but it wasn't done in a hostile way. So one great example is one of our researchers, John, on his ward. The staff actually took a cuddly toy out of the calm down box we'd given them, and they used it as a team mascot. And he came onto the wards one day, and they'd actually stuck it in a hole in the ceiling, and they all pointed to it and were kind of laughing about it. So they weren't really taking it seriously, but it wasn't anything that was kind of too hostile. The third was dismissiveness. So this was where staff indicated that they kind of felt that some of the interventions were a bit patronising. So one of those would be with soft words. One of our researchers came onto a ward, and staff were kind of reading the soft words poster and shaking their heads and kind of tutting about it and saying, oh, we don't need someone to tell us, to do these things. It's things that we know how to do already. The fourth type was actually overt refusal. So this is where people just said straight out, I'm not doing it. So an example of this would be when one of our researchers asked staff to complete a know each other form. And I think actually what their exact words were when she kind of suggested, this is part of Len Bauer's research, and it's something we think will help reduce conflicts and containment. Actually said, well, I don't think Professor Bowers has ever had a patient stalk him before, and then just said that they weren't going to do it. So. And that was quite...
They'd be wrong.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not sure whether you have or not, but I imagine you probably have. But that was an example of just someone outrightly saying they're just not going to do it. And very, very clear example of resistance. The final one, which didn't happen that often, thank goodness, was sabotage. So Alex, one of our researchers on his wards, had an incident where he was bringing them a discharge tree to put on the wall to display the discharge messages, but then the tree disappeared, and so he brought them another one, but then that one disappeared, and so he brought them another one, and then that one disappeared, and they hadn't actually been put out on the ward. He'd been leaving them in the staff office, and when he spoke to staff about it, they were all like, yeah, I don't know what happened to that. And Alex kind of searched everywhere and couldn't find it, and he kind of got the feeling that maybe staff were actually getting rid of the trees that he was bringing. So that was an example of sabotage. So those are the different forms of resistance that you're likely to come across during implementation.
Okay, so how did our researchers overcome those resistances?
I think it depended on the type of resistance. So like I said, passive resistance can be quite difficult to deal with because people don't actually ever tell you they're not going to do something. They're actually telling you that they will do it, but then they're not doing it. And I think you can try and speak to people about that, but if it's not something that they really want to talk about, then there's not much you can do about it. I think in those cases, it's just important to focus on the staff that are really engaged and are actually really enthusiastic, and just kind of focus on them and hope that the other people will kind of maybe come along once things are up and running. I think with what we call mild subversion, so that was the example of using the toy as a mascot. I think with that one again, I think it's not too serious if it's just kind of one or two interventions that people are doing that with, and I think maybe if you just kind of have a laugh along with everyone, but make sure that the intervention is actually kind of up and running at the same time. So maybe let them have the toys and mascot, but use the other stuff in the box. And when people are outrightly refusing to do something, I think you've got an opportunity there just to talk to them about why they're doing that, and that's what our researchers did. And what they found, so the example I gave was to do with the Know Each Other folder, and what they found was people were, did have some genuine concerns about sharing personal information with service users, and that is, in some cases something you can understand. So one member of staff had actually been quite badly bullied by a service user, so was quite reluctant, and I think then you can reach a compromise about the type of information that people can disclose, and also if it is that they've had a really traumatic experience, then I think it's okay to say, okay, well, you don't have to fill it out if you don't want to. Yeah, I think what we found was actually that there were different responses from different people to different interventions. So you rarely got one ward that was kind of refusing to do everything. It would just be one or two things that they might have an issue with. And also that I think the other important thing is just to keep going and keep pushing with it, because people who started out being quite resistant actually ended up being really enthusiastic. And I think once you get the interventions up and running and people can kind of really see the difference they make, and because we got quite a positive response, well actually a really positive response from service users, that helped as well. And all of that kind of together actually meant that a lot of people ended up changing their minds. And we've got the evidence now to show that it really does work. So just to kind of remember that it's something really positive, and it's something that should make a real difference on the wards.